The Price of Betrayal, a wife's ultimate regret. Laura sat at the dimly lit corner of the hotel lounge, swirling the last of her wine in its glass. She hadn't planned to stay this long. The networking event was supposed to be just that, networking. Shake hands, exchange business cards, engage in small talk that led nowhere. But then she met him. Pete Hour. Charming, confident, and effortlessly magnetic, he carried himself like a man who had never known failure. His suit was tailored to perfection, his watch gleamed under the soft glow of the bar lights, and his smirk carried just enough arrogance to make him dangerously appealing. Laura had laughed at one of his jokes, something about their industry's obsession with meaningless jargon, and that was it. A spark, the kind she hadn't felt in years. She was used to stability, a steady marriage, 3 kids, a husband, David, who was everything a woman could ask for, reliable, patient, a good father. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He was safe. With Pete, there was possibility. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, beyond the usual pleasantries. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone. How she sometimes felt invisible in her own home. How she had traded passion for responsibility, adventure for routine. Pete listened, his gaze never wavering. And then, just as she was about to leave, he leaned in slightly, his voice low. Maybe you don't have to choose between the two. That was the first thread of the web. Over the next few weeks, the texts came late at night. First about work, then about everything else. Pete's marriage, he claimed, was a cage. A relationship where 2 people coexisted, pretending they were still in love. Like roommates, he had said. Laura had nodded, understanding too well. And then, one evening, Pete made his move. Come with me, he had whispered over the phone. 2 weeks. Bali. No responsibilities. No pretending. Just us. The words sent a thrill down her spine. She wanted to say no. She should have said no. But instead, she hesitated. That was all it took. Pete sensed it. You deserve more, Laura. And in that moment, she believed him. Laura was meticulous. If she was going to take this step, she would do it her way. She crafted a careful narrative, a business trip, a required training course that just happened to be out of state. She arranged for her in-laws to take the kids. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. But before she left, she did something impulsive, something reckless. She wrote a letter. Not a confession, not exactly. More like an explanation. A justification. She placed it under David's pillow, knowing he wouldn't find it until she was already gone. It read, David, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just write it. For years, I have been trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. I've given everything to this family. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I feel like a shadow of the woman I used to be. And the worst part? I don't think you even see it. I need to do something for me, for once. I don't know what this means for us yet, but please understand, I never wanted to hurt you. Laura. She wasn't sure why she wrote it. Maybe, deep down, she wanted to be caught. Maybe she wanted David to fight for her, to prove that he still saw her. Or maybe she just wanted to believe she wasn't a villain. Either way, the letter was there, and it would change everything. The night before her flight, Laura kissed her children goodnight as if nothing was wrong. Daniel, 16, barely looked up from his phone. Larry, 13, grumbled about school. Sarah, the youngest at 10, hugged her the tightest. Don't be gone too long, Mom, Sarah whispered into her shoulder. Laura forced a smile. I won't. But she knew she was lying. At the airport, Pete was waiting. He flashed her that confident grin, the one that made her feel chosen. Special. As they checked in for their flight, Laura let herself believe, just for a moment, that she was doing the right thing. That this was freedom. But freedom always comes at a cost. And hers was waiting for her back home. Waiting to be discovered. The airport hummed with the chaotic energy of restless travelers. The scent of burnt coffee and duty-free perfume thick in the air. Laura sat beside Pete at gate 37, her manicured nails drumming lightly against her boarding pass. Excitement and nerves battled within her. She was about to board a plane to paradise with a man who made her feel alive again. Pete stretched his legs, checking his watch for the third time. 15 minutes till boarding, he murmured. Laura smiled, but before she could reply, Pete's phone vibrated on the seat between them. He glanced at the screen, and, in an instant, his entire demeanor shifted. His relaxed posture stiffened, his face drained of color, and his jaw tightened like a clenched fist. "What is it?" Laura asked, leaning closer. He swallowed hard, hesitating before turning the screen toward her. The message was short. "Peter Hour, just touch that woman, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." A chill ran down Laura's spine. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pete exhaled slowly, locking his phone and shoving it into his pocket. "I don't know." "Are you sure?" He hesitated. That moment of hesitation sent Laura's heartbeat into overdrive. "You said your wife doesn't know," she pressed. "She doesn't," Pete insisted, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his confidence. Laura's mind raced. Could David have found out? No. Impossible. She had been careful. And yet, "Someone's watching us," she muttered. Pete ran a hand over his face. "It's probably nothing. Some jealous colleague, maybe, or a prank." But Laura wasn't convinced. The message wasn't a casual threat. It was precise. "Peter Hour," a warning, as if the sender knew the exact moment their betrayal would begin. A voice crackled over the speakers, announcing the final boarding call. Pete grabbed his bag. "Come on." Laura hesitated for the briefest second before following him down the jet bridge, but the weight in her chest wouldn't lift. As she buckled her seatbelt, she forced a smile, trying to shake the feeling that somewhere, someone had just set a trap. And she just walked straight into it. Laura sat on the edge of the hotel bed, gripping Pete's phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room smelled of salt air and Balinese incense, but the luxurious surroundings now felt suffocating. Her daughter's voice echoed in her ear. Dad took Daniel and Larry to the cabin. He said he needed time to think. Something was wrong. David never just took the boys to the cabin. That place wasn't a vacation spot. It was an escape, a retreat deep in the woods, where cell service was non-existent and the silence stretched for miles. It was where David went when he needed to clear his mind, to decide things. And now he had taken their sons there, without a word to her. A chill ran down Laura's spine. "Did he seem angry?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "Just different. He was calm, but not normal calm. Like the way he gets when something's already decided." Laura's throat tightened. "Decided?" She forced herself to breathe. "Listen, sweetheart, I need you to do something for me," she said, her voice urgent. "Try to call him. If you get through, tell him I want to talk." "I already tried. No answer." Laura closed her eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had pictured something else entirely. A tense but manageable confrontation upon her return, maybe some tears, a few bitter fights. Then, over time, they would come to an understanding. Maybe even stay married, but on new terms. A modern arrangement. David wasn't supposed to go silent. He wasn't supposed to disappear with the boys. "Mom," Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you okay?" Laura opened her mouth to answer, but she didn't know what to say. So she hung up. David sat in front of the stone fireplace, the orange glow flickering across his face. He had built this cabin with his own hands, back when he still believed in things like forever. The letter sat on the coffee table. His wife's confession, in her own handwriting. "I love you, but I need more. I never meant to hurt you. Please don't be angry." David had read it a dozen times, but each time, the words blurred together into one simple truth. Laura had made a choice. And so had he. He looked at his sons. Daniel, 16, sat on the couch, hands clasped, jaw tight. Larry, only 13, stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. "Your mom's gone," David said finally, his voice steady. She chose to be somewhere else. Daniel swallowed hard. Is she coming back? David met his son's gaze. I don't know, but I do know this. I'm not going to let her lie to us anymore. Larry's face twisted. She's a liar. David didn't correct him. Silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Daniel spoke. What happens now? David exhaled, slow and controlled. We move on, together. Larry looked at his father, searching his face for something, comfort, maybe, or certainty. David gave him neither. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a legal document. Filed that morning. A petition for full custody. Laura stood on the balcony of her hotel room, staring at the vast, endless ocean. A paradise she could no longer enjoy. Pete was still asleep inside, oblivious to the storm building inside her. She had called David's phone 10 times. No answer. She tried Sarah again. Voicemail. Then she made the call she had been dreading. Her lawyer picked up on the second ring. Laura. His voice was measured. Professional. I need to secure my assets, she said, skipping the pleasantries. David knows. He's making moves. There was a pause. He already froze your accounts this morning. Laura's stomach lurched. What? He restricted all joint assets. Legally, he's within his rights. Her fingers dug into the balcony railing. That's impossible. I should have had time. He was one step ahead. Laura's vision blurred with rage. David had played this perfectly. While she was sipping cocktails in Bali, thinking she was in control, he had dismantled everything. She had underestimated him. And now, she was trapped. In that moment, something inside Laura snapped. She had made a mistake, a big one. But if David thought he could erase her from their children's lives, if he thought he could win, he was wrong. She was not going to let him take her kids away. And if she had to fight him to the bitter end, so be it. She wasn't going down without a war. Laura sat on the hotel balcony, staring at the glittering Bali skyline. The humid air clung to her skin as she sipped from a glass of wine, but the taste was bitter now. Something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not physically, but from afar, like a shadow creeping closer, just beyond her vision. Pete lay sprawled on the bed inside, half asleep, his phone buzzing with work emails. He had been distant lately. The excitement that once burned between them was fading. The secrecy had been thrilling before. Furtive glances, stolen kisses, whispered conversations. Now it just felt exhausting. She checked her phone again. Still no response from David. The children hadn't texted back, either. That wasn't like them. Her fingers hovered over the call button, but something inside her resisted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe, just maybe, she already knew. David knew. By morning, Laura couldn't stand the silence anymore. She needed reassurance, something solid to hold on to. She grabbed her purse and took a taxi to the bank. If David was giving her the silent treatment, fine, but she needed to make sure her personal assets were untouched. Inside the bank, the marble floors echoed under her heels as she approached the teller. "I'd like to check the balance on my personal account," she said, forcing a smile. The teller typed a few keys, then frowned. "Ma'am, there's a restriction on your account." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" The teller hesitated, lowering her voice. "A legal hold. It was placed this morning by your husband." A strange numbness spread through Laura's chest. She gripped the counter. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am. All joint accounts, property investments, and liquid assets are currently frozen under legal review." "I'm sorry." Laura stepped back, her mind racing. David had moved first. But how? How had he found out so quickly? She turned away, pulse hammering. There was only one answer. He had known before she left. Back at the hotel, Laura stormed into the room, her breath uneven. Pete looked up from his phone. "What's wrong?" he asked. "What's wrong?" she echoed, her voice sharp. "David locked my accounts. He's filed something legally. He knows Pete." Pete sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. How could he know? I don't know, she snapped. But I need to get ahead of this. I need to. She stopped mid-sentence. Pete wasn't listening. He was checking his phone, scrolling through messages. Are you even paying attention? She seethed. I just have some work stuff, Pete muttered, his eyes flicking between her and the screen. Laura snatched the phone from his hand. Her breath caught. There on his screen was a text. From his wife. I know everything. Don't come home. Laura's stomach dropped. Oh my God, she whispered. Pete grabbed the phone back, his face paling. This isn't what it looks like. She stared at him in disbelief. It's exactly what it looks like, Pete. Your wife found out too. Pete rubbed his temples. Look, I don't know how she found out, but she found out because David knew, Laura cut in. And if David knew, he told her. Pete's silence confirmed what she feared. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a trap. David had seen the storm coming and had stepped out of the way, letting her walk straight into it. Laura needed a plan. Fast. She dug through her bag, pulling out her laptop. She still had separate investments, a rental property in Sarah's name. If she moved quickly, she could secure them before David tied up everything in legal red tape. But as she logged in, another shock awaited her. Her email was flooded with legal notifications. Petition for full custody, filed this morning. Petition for divorce, filed this morning. Restraining order from financial transactions, approved. It was already happening. David had taken everything before she even knew she had lost it. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She felt like she was drowning. And Pete? Pete was still sitting there, scrolling through his phone, already moving on. He wasn't panicked like she was. He wasn't trapped. Because he had nothing to lose. She turned to him, her voice cold now. You planned for this, didn't you? Pete frowned. What? You knew this could happen, so you covered yourself. You never put your own money at risk. You never left anything traceable. You let me take all the risks. Pete's silence told her everything. And for the first time, Laura realized the full extent of her mistake. She had been so focused on escaping one life, she had walked straight into the arms of a man who would never fight for her. David had fought. David had acted. Pete had just been along for the ride. That night, Laura lay awake, staring at her phone. She had called, texted, emailed. Nothing. Not from David. Not from Sarah. Not from any of her children. She was cut off. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't sure she could ever fix it. Laura had never been one to feel true fear until now. As she and Pete stepped off the plane, reality hit her like a blow to the stomach. Gone were the carefree sunsets and secret whispers of Bali. The humid, tropical air was replaced with the cold, sterile atmosphere of the airport terminal, where everything felt sharper, more real. She tried to call David. No answer. Her children? Nothing. Panic set in. Something was wrong. Pete, sensing her unease, pulled out his phone and muttered, Maybe we're just overthinking this. I'll call my wife and smooth things over. Before he could finish, his phone buzzed. A single text. I know everything. Don't come home. The blood drained from his face. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. The trap had already been sprung. The next morning, Laura arrived at her lawyer's office, her stomach in knots. Her attorney, Susan Holbrook, was already waiting, her lips pursed, eyes calculating. Susan was a shark, the kind of woman who relished tearing opposing arguments apart in the courtroom. But today, she didn't look like she was preparing for a battle she could win. David had filed for divorce. Not just any divorce, an all-out war. Full custody, asset freezes, evidence of adultery. The documents were placed in front of Laura, thick and neatly stacked, like a carefully arranged execution order. Laura swallowed hard. He can't do this. The house is half mine. We built it together. Susan barely glanced up. He's filed an emergency injunction to keep you from setting foot on the property. Laura's stomach twisted. The kids? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've refused contact with you," Susan said, this time looking at her with something close to pity. "They've made their wishes very clear." Laura shook her head. "No, no, that's impossible. Sarah wouldn't do that to me. And Daniel? He's old enough to understand that marriages are complicated. He wouldn't." Susan sighed and pushed a printed email across the table. Laura's hands trembled as she picked it up. It was from Daniel. "Mom, I don't know what you thought would happen, but we're not little kids anymore. We know what you did. You lied to us, to Dad, to everyone. And now you want to come back and pretend like nothing happened? We don't want to see you. You chose Pete. Go live with him." Daniel. A sharp, painful breath escaped her lips. She clutched the paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. Susan watched her carefully. "He's 16, Laura. The court will take his wishes seriously." "But Sarah wrote one too." Laura flinched. She couldn't read another. She didn't need to. Her own children had turned against her. At the courthouse, Laura finally saw David for the first time in weeks. He sat across the table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were something else entirely. Cold, calculated. A man who had once given her everything now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The opposing attorney, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we'd like to present Exhibit A." A screen flickered on. Security footage. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she watched herself, walking through the airport, arm in arm with Pete. They were laughing, unaware of the cameras tracking their every move. She could practically hear her own words from that moment. "It's just 2 weeks. What's the worst that could happen?" The screen cut to black. Silence. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you like to explain?" Laura's mouth was dry. She turned to Susan for help, but even her lawyer seemed weary. The judge wasn't asking because he needed an explanation. He already had everything he needed. There was more. A private investigator's report detailing their entire affair. Bank records showing Laura's failed attempt to move assets out of joint accounts. The letter, the damning, arrogant letter she had left behind, thinking she was in control of the situation. And finally, the statement from her children, testifying that they no longer trusted her. David had played the long game. He had gathered every piece of evidence before she even knew the battle had begun. Laura was a fighter. She wouldn't go down without trying. She begged for joint custody. She swore she'd make things right. She even turned on the tears, hoping for some shred of sympathy. But David never looked at her. Not once. And when the judge finally spoke, it was with an air of finality. "Mr. Caldwell is granted full custody of the children. Mrs. Caldwell's visitation rights will be at the discretion of the minors involved." It was over. Her children had been given the power to decide, and they had already chosen. David stood, buttoning his suit jacket. For a brief moment, he looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, just nothing. Laura wanted to scream, to claw at him, to make him see her. But there was nothing left to fight for. He had won, and she had lost everything. Laura sat in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of regret pressing down on her like an iron vice. The apartment smelled of stale wine and unopened bills, her life now reduced to a space barely big enough for her thoughts. She used to have a home, a family. Now she had silence, except for the occasional buzz of a notification that never came from the people who mattered. Her children refused to speak to her. Weeks had turned into months. At first, she had texted them daily, then weekly. Now, she hesitated before sending anything at all, knowing the likelihood of being ignored was close to absolute. But tonight, something inside her snapped. This wasn't fair. David had stolen her life. He had poisoned their children against her. He had orchestrated this entire downfall with precision, ensuring that when she fell, there was no one to catch her. He hadn't just divorced her, he had erased her. And she would not accept it. She picked up her phone, scrolling through old pictures of her family. Her fingers trembled as she found one from 2 years ago, a birthday dinner. David sat at the head of the table, his usual calm presence commanding the room. The kids laughed, unaware of the slow disintegration of their mother's loyalty. She clenched her jaw. He thinks he's won. But he hadn't. Not yet. Laura had spent weeks preparing. She had learned everything she could about David's routine, where he shopped, when he worked out, what time he picked up the kids from school. It was all too easy. He was a creature of habit, a man who believed in structure and control. And that was his weakness. She didn't just want revenge. She wanted to be seen, to remind him that no matter how much he tried to erase her, she still existed. So, she crafted a plan. She would wait for him at the one place where he would be forced to face her, their home. The night was cold, the wind whispering through the trees as Laura stood outside the house she once called home. The porch light was on, casting a golden glow over the welcome mat. The same mat she had picked out years ago, the same mat she had wiped her shoes on every evening after work, the same mat that now belonged to a world she had been exiled from. Through the window, she saw them, David and the children, gathered in the living room. They were watching a movie, curled up on the couch with blankets and popcorn, a scene so perfect it made Laura's stomach churn with rage and sorrow. It should have been her. She took a deep breath and knocked. A moment later, David opened the door. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he looked bored, as if this moment had played out in his mind long before she ever decided to show up. Laura. His voice was flat, emotionless. Her heart pounded. I need to see them. David didn't move. No. Laura swallowed. David, please. I'm still their mother. A flicker of something, anger perhaps, flashed in his eyes. You stopped being their mother the moment you chose someone else over them. Her hands clenched into fists. I didn't choose anything. I was lost. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you get to turn them against me. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You think this is about me? Laura, they don't want to see you. You broke their trust. They made that decision. No, her voice wavered. They're just listening to you. You. She stopped herself, realizing how desperate she sounded. She took a step closer, her voice softer. David, you know me. You know I love them. You know I love you. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of amusement. And then, laughter. Not the warm laughter she had once adored, but cold, cruel laughter. You love me? He repeated. No, Laura. You love the idea of me. You love the security, the stability, the way I made you feel safe. But when you had a chance to be free, to chase your happiness, you didn't hesitate. She shook her head, her eyes burning. I was wrong. David's expression hardened. Yes, you were. She reached out, trying to touch his arm, but he stepped back. David, go home, Laura. His voice was like stone. If you even have one. The door shut. And just like that, she was outside again. Alone. The cold seeped in her bones as she stood there, frozen in place, staring at the door that had just closed in her face. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be unwanted. She didn't remember the drive back to her apartment. The streetlights blurred, her vision clouded by unshed tears. By the time she reached her empty, silent apartment, the weight of everything crushed her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear something apart. But there was nothing left to destroy. So she poured herself a drink. And then another. And another. She had wanted revenge. Instead, she had been annihilated. And David? David had won. The years had not been kind to Laura. She sat alone in a dimly lit apartment, the flickering streetlight outside casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The place smelled faintly of old coffee and forgotten dreams, just like her life. The woman who once commanded attention in boardrooms and turned heads at parties was now a ghost of herself, a faded version of the woman David had once loved. She had tried, in the beginning, to piece her life back together. After the court ruling, She fought for months to reconnect with her children. She called. She sent letters. She even showed up at their school once, standing at a distance, hoping for a glance of familiarity, a moment of recognition. But all she saw was the way they turned away from her. Sarah, once her little girl who used to braid her hair in the mornings, had stared at her with a look Laura could only describe as disgust. Larry, the quiet one, had refused to even acknowledge her presence. And Daniel, her firstborn, the one she had always thought would understand, had walked past her as if she were nothing more than a stranger in the crowd. They had chosen David. Of course they had. David had been the one who stayed, the one who wiped their tears, attended their school plays, and held them when they cried about the mother who abandoned them. The realization cut deeper than she had expected. The truth settled in her bones, cold and immovable. She hadn't just betrayed David. She had betrayed them all. One afternoon, years later, Laura found herself driving through familiar streets, past the park where she once pushed Sarah on the swings, past the cafe where she and David used to share quiet Sunday mornings. She hadn't meant to, but her hands had guided her to the one place she had no right to be. David's house. Not their house. Not anymore. From her car, she could see the life she used to have. The front porch light was on, a warm glow spilling onto the neatly trimmed lawn. Laughter drifted from the backyard, her children's laughter. And then she saw them. David was standing on the porch, arms wrapped around a woman. A younger woman, perhaps in her late 30s. She was laughing at something he said, leaning into him with a familiarity that made Laura's stomach twist. His new wife. The woman who now had the life Laura had thrown away. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out, now a grown woman. She looked happy, radiant even. Behind her, Larry and Daniel followed, and Laura felt her heart crack a little more. They looked so whole, so complete, as if she had never even existed. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to scream, to step out of the car and remind them that she had been a part of their lives, once, that she had loved them. But deep down she knew, love wasn't enough when trust had been shattered. So she sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, watching the life that had moved on without her. And then she did the only thing left to do. She drove away. Laura spent her nights in silence now. No more late-night phone calls from friends. No more texts from lovers. The men who had once pursued her, the ones who had found her exciting, dangerous, intoxicating, they had all disappeared when the scandal had settled. She thought about reaching out to Pete once, but she knew it was pointless. He had crawled back to his wife, probably swearing he had been manipulated, that it was all Laura's fault. Maybe it was. In the end, she was the one left with nothing. David had won, but it wasn't a victory he had needed to fight for. She had handed it to him, gift-wrapped in deceit and betrayal. And the cruelest part? His revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. He had erased her. And that, more than anything, was the punishment she never saw coming.